Okay, so Middle Kingdom, that's what we're going to talk about in this video. So around 2150 BCE, the Egyptians they actually challenged the power of the weak kings of the Sixth Dynasty, which is the last dynasty in the Old Kingdom. And the land was kind of in a state of civil unrest, and it was near anarchy for a period of time. In 2040 BCE, the king of Upper Egypt, Mentuhotep II, managed to unite Egypt again under a single ruler. And this was basically the beginning of the Middle Kingdom. Once those two nations were united under Mentuhotep II, that was the beginning. And it lasted about 400 years. So most sculpture during the Middle Kingdom adhered to the same conventions that the Old Kingdom had, but there were some innovations, and we will go over those in this lecture video. So this is actually the portrait of Senseret III, and it's definitely a departure from the norm of the Old Kingdom, and it does represent a sharp break from the old conventions of the Old Kingdom. So there's a lot of realism in the rendition of the king's features, which is unusual. Typically, they wouldn't show that much realism in a portrait of the king. Typically, it's a very generic face, unlined, perfect, youthful face. But you can see that he has lines in his forehead, he has some sagging flesh, there are signs of aging in his face. And he definitely has kind of a pessimistic expression, which dominated the mood in Egypt at the time just because of all the civil unrest. And this king, Senseret III, had his hands full. I mean, his kingdom was unstable, and he had to lead several military campaigns against Nubia, their neighbor to the south, I believe, that were very unsuccessful. So he was having a hard time, basically. So this is made out of red quartzite. It's a little over a foot tall, from the 12th dynasty, which is 1860 to 1850. So actually they do have the body of this sculpture, I believe, and it is a very youthful depiction of his body. So we have a very realistic head paired with a youthful body, which is probably meant to symbolize he possessed a lot of youthful vigor, but he was wise as well. So that is what scholars think the reasoning for that was, that he had that youthful, vigorous body, but then the wise face and head of a wise man. So we'll talk about architecture. Middle Kingdom tombs consisted of rock-cut tombs made for wealthy people, kings. So it wasn't just kings that had these tombs, it was also wealthy people. And this tomb replaced the mastaba as the standard Egyptian tomb type. So this is a tomb of, I kind of have a hard time saying this, but Khuhotep II. And it's typical of a Middle Kingdom tomb. It features the typical kind of shallow columnar porch, which is, there's kind of a porch area in here, kind of a smaller area with columns. And then it leads into another columned hall, and then finally ends with a burial chamber at the end of the hall, basically. And there are statues of the deceased in different niches in the wall, and there's a lot of painted reliefs on the walls and murals as well. The columns serve no supporting function in a lot of these tombs. Since the tomb is cut from the rock here, this opening, the columns are not really supporting anything. If we removed these columns, this would still remain stable. So they're more of just a decorative item. Okay, we'll move inside. And so this is what the columnar hall kind of would look to, like the big hallway that you walk through lined with columns, and you can see this one's broken, this column here, and it's obviously it's okay because they're just decorative. They're not actually supporting anything because the tomb is cut from rock, so it doesn't need columns. But so these shafts still have flutes, but these are much more refined. So they no longer look like a bunch of, like a bundle of papyrus, basically, like the ones that we looked at Dozier's mortuary complex in Saqqara. And the Greeks went on to use this design in their temple building. So now we're entering into the New Kingdom, which is the final kingdom of ancient Egypt. So the Middle Kingdom actually ended up collapsing when a new people came in called the Hyksos, and they invaded and they ruled the Nile Delta and Lower Egypt for several years before the native Egyptian kings rose up in revolt. And King Ahmose I was the final conqueror of the Hyksos, and the first king of the 18th dynasty, which is considered a new kingdom king. And this is when the Egyptians became known as pharaohs. So if you hear them referred to as pharaohs in any other time period besides the New Kingdom, that's actually incorrect. You should only call them kings. The only true pharaohs that existed in ancient Egypt were during the New Kingdom. So the capital remained at Memphis, but Thebes in Upper Egypt rose into prominence due to the growing importance of the god worship there, which was Amun-Re, which I believe was the sun god. And Thebes really became known for its magnificent palaces, tombs, temples along both banks on either side of the Nile River. So you would go down the Nile, and on either side there'd be these elaborate tombs and palaces on either side of the Nile in the Thebes district. So we'll kind of start talking about architecture. So huge, elaborate temples are definitely the most impressive monuments to come out of the New Kingdom. So we'll take a look at a couple of those. Some were built to worship the gods, and others were mortuary temples, which provided the pharaohs with a place to worship their gods, but also served as their home after they died. So the Thebes district along the Nile definitely has the most impressive temples. So this is a mortuary temple for the pharaoh Hatshepsut, and from the 18th dynasty, 1473 through 1458 BCE. And she was a female pharaoh, so she was very unusual in that regard. So this temple rises from the valley floor in basically 3 terraces. I think this is the first terrace, the second terrace, and then the third terrace here, with the central staircase kind of leading you up deeper into the temple. There's columns on each of the terraces, so that line the terraces. And if we were to basically draw a line down the central axis of this temple, it would be symmetrical on either side. And Senenmut is thought to be the architect that designed this temple for Hatshepsut. And the temple fits in nicely with the surrounding landscape. The verticals of the columns rhythm the light and dark echo of the surrounding cliff faces. So, it does fit in nicely with the landscape. And the temple was once part of a very much larger complex. And the temple had many shrines dedicated to the important Egyptian gods. But the most important god for the New Kingdom was definitely Amun-Re. And this temple also had over 200 sculptures in it. So on the lowest terrace on either side of the processional way, it might be hard to see from this picture, but there are representations of Hatshepsut as a sphinx on either side of the columnar way. or the processional way, I should say. And there's a lot of statues of the queen as a sphinx or just as a female pharaoh standing, seated or kneeling. So there's just a lot of sculpture of her, representations of her throughout this complex. So here's an example of Hatshepsut with offering jars from the upper court of her mortuary temple. And this statue suffered the fate of many of the other statues of Hatshepsut, is that it was smashed to pieces at a later date after her death, they believe. And luckily, we were able to put it back together so we could see what it originally looked like. But here she's kneeling, and she actually has a globe-shaped offering jars, and she has those in each hand, and she's taking part in a ritual offering to the god here, or to the gods, I should say. And she's wearing the king's beard. She has the king's headdress on. So she is anatomically male here, but we know it's her from inscriptions, I believe, on it, on the actual sculpture. So at the beginning of her reign, she would depict herself as a female. She was very, curvilinear. She was very curvy. But later on in her rule, she kept going more and more masculine until her representations were male in all of the sculptures and everything that represented her in her later reign. So here are the king and queen of Punt and attendants, and this is a relief from the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut, and it's painted limestone. It's about a little over a foot tall, and this is basically a relief that shows Hatshepsut's successful expedition to a faraway land called Punt. And you can see in this detail that bare-chested men carry local goods of gold and frankincense into their ships, and then they're going to take that back to Egypt. So that's what they're carrying here. So they're getting, things that they wanted from the land of Punt, I guess, to take back to Egypt. And the Queen of Punt is actually depicted as this kind of weirdly misshapen woman. And art historians wonder if that's how she was actually shaped, and they're actually recording that in the rock, in this relief, or if that's just the way of showing that she was foreign. So it's kind of hard to tell what they're doing there. So we're not quite sure why she's misshapen the way she is, but... So this is the rock-cut mortuary temple of King Ramses II. And this actually had to be moved 700 feet away when they built the dam on the Nile that would have submerged it if they hadn't moved it. So they literally had to take this apart and put it back together 700 miles. I don't know if it was upstream or downstream, but they did have to move it. In 1968, they did that. So Ramses II is a very famous king. He reigned for around 65 years, which is a huge accomplishment because life expectancy was really not very long during this time. And so this temple was designed so that the summer and winter solstices and the rising sun will come in, and it'll illuminate the king's image on the inside of the temple. So there's 4 giant sculptures in the front. They're about 65 feet tall, and they are facing Nubia, which is kind of, I think that's the neighbor to the south of Egypt, and the Egyptians just were constantly fighting with them, and they were definitely somebody that Ramses II did not like, and they served to intimidate Nubia. So the large sculptures do not have a lot of detail or refinement in them. The sculptures definitely traded size for detail when making these statues. So here's the interior of the Temple of Ramses. It's that columned hall. Of course, these are columns that are people, which is kind of a little different. And then the interior tomb in the middle. And you can see there's lots of relief sculpture and murals paintings on basically covering every inch of the inside of the temple. So this is the restored view of the Temple of Amun-Re, looking southeast from Karnak, Egypt.